Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this FlaskUp.com Mr. Pandaria raiding guide. And in this video we're going to be taking a look at the Iron Juggernaut on normal mode. Now in order to complete this fight you're going to want to bring 2 tanks, 2 to 3 healers, however I do advise 3 for possibly your first few tries, and then the remaining a mixture of both melee and ranged DPS. Now this fight is very healer intensive and it is also a 2-phase fight, however you should keep in mind that you only need to tank him during phase 1 as he becomes stationary in phase 2. You'll also want to make sure that you are standing against something for phase 2, but we will talk about this later on in the guide. Now during phase 1 he actually casts quite a few abilities, but first of all let's take a look at the tank swap ability. Now this is called Flame Vents, and the Iron Juggernaut will cast a frontal cone of flame in front of him. Now any player that gets hit by this frontal cone will have a debuff applied to them called Ignite Armor, and this will increase the damage that they take by fire effects by 10%, and it will also sear your flesh for a small amount of damage every second. Now obviously you only want one tank to be in front of the boss when he casts this, and you want the boss to be facing away from the raid at all times during the fight. We recommend you swap on 2 to 3 stacks of the Ignite Armor debuff. Now during this phase he will also fire randomly at players that are in the raid with his laser burn ability. Now this laser will inflict a high amount of fire damage to random players, and it will also leave a little debuff on them that deals a little bit of fire damage every 2 seconds. Unfortunately your healers just have to heal through this, there's not much else they can do. Now what you'll probably also notice in the video is that these red circles are appearing on the ground, and this is his mortar cannon. And what he will do is he will launch shrapnel and explosives at a random player, and if the player gets hit by these it will inflict a high amount of fire damage to anyone that is within 8 yards of the blast. It's a pretty simple ability really, you just need to make sure that if you do see a red patch on the ground you move away from it and don't get hit by anything. His next ability in this phase is called Borer Drill, and this is where he digs his arms into the ground, well his drill arm into the ground, and it causes the earth to crack and shatter. Now this ripples out in many directions, and although we don't think it targets players, it does kind of follow them, but it can go off at random kind of curves and swerves whenever it likes. So players do need to be aware of where the Borer Drill's ripples are going, and as you see in the video I do get caught off guard by it a few times. This deals a moderate amount of physical damage to you, and the damage just has to be healed through. Now his main ability in this phase, which you've probably already seen in the background as well, is called Crawler Mines, and this is where the Iron Juggernaut will release several Crawler Mines throughout this phase. I think he releases them in batches of 3. Now these Crawler Mines will scatter out and they bury themselves into the ground, and once they've buried themselves they will begin to cast a detonation sequence. Now at the end of the detonation sequence they will blow up and inflict a very high amount of physical damage to all players in the raid. However, brave players, quote unquote brave there, are able to actually stomp on these mines, which is just by right clicking on them, which will cause the explosion to become localized at that player's feet. Now this explosion will inflict over 1 million physical damage and knock the player up into the air. Oh my days, how do we deal with this, I guess you're thinking. Your tanks are key in this fight for both tanking the boss and stomping on mines. It's like they get to play a game of Minesweeper, but World of Warcraft edition. Whenever these mines spawns, whichever tank isn't currently tanking the boss will want to go around and right click on these mines as fast as possible in order to get rid of them. They'll get shot up in the air and take a small amount of damage due to the amount of physical reduction they actually have. It may also be worth noting if the mines are spread fairly far apart and the tank can only get to 1 or 2 of them, other players can also take them by using abilities such as Dispersion and Deterrence in order to negate the damage. Now you may have noticed that the Iron Juggernaut has an energy bar, however he doesn't gain any special abilities or anything based on his energy level. That's just simply there to indicate a phase change, and he will enter phase 2 when he reaches 100 energy. Now during this phase he becomes stationary and plants himself in the ground, and at this point in the fight, as you're going to see in the video in the background, you want to make sure that all of your raid members have got their backs to a very close wall or something along those lines, anything to stop them getting knocked back substantially. Now during this phase he will cast several abilities, all of which deal a very high amount of damage to your raid, so this is super happy fun healing times. His first ability is called Seismic Activity, and this will cause him to drill deep into the earth, causing a violent earthquake, which will inflict a moderate amount of nature damage every second to all players throughout this phase. Now, additionally, this seismic activity will also cause an intermittent shock pulse, and this is the reason you need to have your backs against something during this phase, because the shock pulse will cause a wave of force that knocks players back a very, very far distance if they aren't, against something to break the knockback. So this is why it's key to be against something, otherwise you'll probably get thrown to, I don't know, the other side of Azeroth if you aren't against something. That's how far the knockback is. Now during this phase he will also use an ability called Demolisher Cannons, and this is where he will fire cannons high up into the air, and these will go over random players and inflict a high amount of fire damage to players that are within 6 yards of the landing zone. Again, this is marked out on the ground, make sure you're not standing in it and taking damage that you don't need to. Now during this phase he's also got two abilities that work well together. His first ability is called Cutter Laser, and this is where his tail cannon will track a player, and it will chase that player around, and if the laser cutter does hit that player it will inflict a high amount of fire damage every second to them, and it could eventually kill them depending on how long they do get hit for, but the damage is quite substantial. Now his next ability is called Explosive Tar, and this is where he will spew tar in all directions. As you can probably see in the video, there's loads of tar scattered everywhere during this phase, and standing in the tar will deal a small amount of nature damage to you every second, and it will also reduce your movement speed by 30%. Now this is where you're going to struggle if you get the cutter laser on you, as you may need to use like a leap of faith from a priest or some kind of blinking ability to get away from it if it does chase you. Additionally, if the cutter laser does go through one of the puddles of tar, it will cause the puddle of tar to explode, which will inflict a high amount of fire damage to everyone in the raid. This is really damage you could do without, especially since this phase is pretty healer intensive as it is anyway. So that's going to do it for this Mists of Pandaria raiding guide. If you would like to view a written version of this guide, then you can head on over to flaskup.com or click on the link in the video description below. Alternatively, if you'd like to check out any more of our normal mode guides for this tier of raiding, then please do feel free to click on one of the annotations that are currently on screen now. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this Mists of Pandaria raiding guide, then please do feel free to subscribe to the channel.